Immigration. Now, if you and or your family have been living in America for most of your life, if not all, and if you and or your family are involved in politics, then you must have at least heard of the immigration issue taking place. Now, immigration has existed throughout all America's existence, so it makes you wonder why it hasn't been resolved yet. I mean, we have the Statue of Liberty and other symbols of freedom for immigrants, or at least that would seem to be the case. Now, we have a textbook in my class called Discovering the American Past, and it does have a chapter that solely focuses on immigration in California, but it's an issue that encompasses all the country. It does give an interesting perspective, however, with the four waves of eras where immigration took place. The first one, of course, being the Pilgrims and the slaves they brought with them, even though that is forced immigration. There's the second wave, which was largely European, most Europeans coming from the southern or eastern countries. And around the same time, there was Chinese immigrants on the west coast, mostly doing labor on the railroad. And the book actually doesn't mark its fourth one, but I believe it's supposed to be continued Asian immigration and Hispanic immigration. Now, what all four of these groups have in common is that they all face anti-Semitism. They're receiving hate, and especially the Chinese with the Chinese Exclusion Act. But despite that, California is still a very diverse state. But they have had issues with the use of braceros, and that sort of use eventually brought about Zoot Suit riots into the state. But we're looking for sources of the past that will help us determine what the future of immigration will be. Now, our first book is called American Immigration, and it's brought in more detail to this, saying that there was Irish immigration before the country was fully formed, and brings in more detail of immigration in the early 1900s. Even though it did reach a decline, it would eventually be brought back up again due to Jewish refugees having to be brought in. Filipino immigrants and Canadian immigrants rushed in during the 20s, but the country's problem with immigration at this time was the risk of overpopulation, and this has brought on a lot of policies that were against them. They had their own newspapers that could help distribute their voice, but that largely got wiped away by the news coverage of the Second World War. The second book selected is This Is Our Land, and it will help discuss why there was this suppression. Now, it does start off saying that there were historical figures like George Washington who did support immigrants, even though it may have mostly been for labor, but other politicians were trying to preserve who they believed were the original pilgrims, the original immigrants, and they called them the Anglo-Saxons. And this brought on a sort of political policy of nativism, a sort of mockery of, or the term Native American. And this would eventually lead to immigrants living in isolated parts of cities, especially the slums, as they believed that they couldn't assimilate them into American society. And they would especially be biased even if they were of the same race, as long as they weren't inherently American in their eyes, then they weren't necessarily equal. Nativism is what this book does believe is causing issues with immigration, but I have found a third source that is a little over 100 years old that gives more perspective of people from right in the middle of the times of immigration. And it does start off with a nationalistic tone, calling on to the people of America and so on. But they were able to see that there were issues with their current immigration system, such as with literacy tests being unbiased to anyone who could be disabilitated or just don't know that much American literacy at their age. But they eventually showed more loyalty towards America and eventually called on for more laws against immigrants and for industrialists to protect their jobs. They did have good intentions at first, so there's nativism, not being able to have their voice heard, and laws affecting immigrants in modern America. So what could this mean for the future? I think a good place to look for the answers involves how racism has been on a decline in the country. Now, not all events of immigration involve racism, but we're in a world that has become less accepting of racism and has become far less nationalistic, and you can practically see it all over social medias, any other form of media that is anti-hate. And the people supporting these messages are part of the next generations. So if any of those people ever have a hand in politics in the near future, and if those today can just extend a helping hand towards immigrants today, then I think what will happen in the future will largely rely on the choices that the generations of the present and the future make.